Thanks, Peter. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. And it's good to be back here again. You all indulged me last year by listening to my talk on the sacred geometry of Washington, D.C. And I noticed that Dan Brown has picked up on that theme with his latest book. So it is obviously a topical subject. But in a way, that book was clearing a backlog. Because when I began looking at Britain, British history, the British megalithic sites, over 30 years ago, of course it was Avebury that fascinated me. And I was just impelled to think about the place and visit the place and try to understand something about it, but I didn't have anything to say. And at that point, realizing that I had very little to say about Avebury, I went to the States. And I spent time over there, and it was a very important interlude. It taught me many things, not least an understanding of the role of the wilderness. The animals, the big animals in particular, the animals that no longer inhabit these islands. So when I came back, I felt I was bringing a lot of knowledge with me, but it's taken a long time to ground myself back in this land. And in the end, it was Avebury that called me, presented itself to my attention, and I just feel very humbled indeed that this information has come, that at last we're getting some deeper illumination into what our ancestors were doing here in this land all those many, many years ago. Now, when I jumped into the topic, I realized that well, at times I felt completely underwater. It's so massive. There's so much connected with Avebury and all the sites around it that I couldn't possibly cover them all. And in this talk too, that it's not going to be possible to go very deeply into the whole topic, but we'll just have a look and just go in where we can and explore and see what opens up. And it's been fun doing these recreations. I don't think they can really do justice to what was there thousands of years ago, but they're fun, aren't they? They're good to look at, and they give us an idea of what Avebury was all about. So, we're going to begin at Windmill Hill. And here is a plan of the enclosure that the first people who settled in the Avebury area built at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC. So they built these concentric rings on the hilltop. It's about a mile outside of Avebury, after about 3800 BCE. These were Mesolithic people. And it seems that Mesolithic culture in Britain had developed in other areas at first, especially in the west. And people came and settled in the Avebury area quite late, relatively speaking. And this could be because of the nature of the water supply in this part of the world. It's chalk. These are chalk hills. It's very porous. The rain just dissolves into the surface of the land. And as a result, the springs and the streams dry up in the summer months. So it's possible that people only began settling on Windmill Hill in the late autumn, when the springs and the streams began to flow again. So we have a picture. People coming, arriving in the area, hunting, gathering, and bringing with them their herds of animals. This is the innovation. This is the Neolithic revolution, the agricultural revolution. They're pasturing animals, and they're beginning to grow some grain crops. Probably for these people, their cattle, their pigs were more important. As the year drew to a close, they began to sacrifice, treat some of these animals in a very reverential way, slaughtered them and placed them in these ditches and in the pits of the enclosures. Sometimes it's bones, disjointed bones, sometimes whole animals, whole cattle are laid to rest in these pits. A few miles south of Avebury is another one of these causewayed enclosures. A hilltop with a ring, a bank and ditch around the summit. This one's known as Knapp Hill. Several of these enclosures were built in the area, but then at some point in the middle of the 4th millennium BC, the first real innovations begin. These people begin to build in stone. And they built a long barrow, West Kennet Long Barrow. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. We've got a little view inside. I've no idea what the lights are. They begin to build in stone. So there's a transitional period here. There's some earlier monuments in the area, Fossils Lodge. They're using timber to prop up the banks of the Long Barrow. But now they're beginning to use stone. Of course, the date of this, 3600 BC. They're working in mud brick in Egypt. Barry brought our attention to the other early megalithic builders in Europe. But this is an extraordinary early date. And these people entered into a very complex relationship with this Long Barrow and others in the area. It seems to have been used for the interment of the dead, but not all of their dead. And in many cases, not always the entire body. It's quite likely parts of the body, parts of the skeleton were taken out, used, displayed in other contexts before being put back in again. This Long Barrow perhaps was in use for 1,000 years or even more before it was closed. And this is the people of Avebury put this massive blocking stone up across the entrance to the Long Barrow, effectively sealing it after 1,000 years or more of use. Now here we have another reconstruction, and we're well over 1,000 years later, and we're at another site in the Avebury area known as the Sanctuary. And it's a combination of timber and stone. I've suggested a possible reconstruction here. I've put lintels, wooden lintels on top of the wooden posts. Gives it a coherence. But they combine stone with this monument too. This is how it might have looked like towards the end of the 3rd millennium. But before we begin talking about what these sites may have been used for, what they were all about, there's a question I want to bring to your attention. And it is a question of identity. Who were these people? Who were these Mesolithic, transitional, Neolithic, early farmers and settlers? And I like this figure because it doesn't seem to have a skin. There's a suggestion that the boundary between the person, the identity, the self, and the world can be ambiguous. You know, how do we see ourselves? How did these people see themselves? I'm sure it was very different. Now, what I've got here is a reconstruction. Now, it's very romantic, okay, but it shows a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer scene. And when we look back at these people of the past, our ancestors, we're often caught between two polarities. One is they were primitive. These were savages. And of course that view has tied in very much with our ideas of evolution, Darwinian evolutionism, that anything back in the past was less developed. These people therefore were more primitive, not as sophisticated as us. Or that these people lived in a utopia, that these people lived in a society governed by a mother goddess who made sure everyone loved each other and lived in harmony, or were incredibly sophisticated and had knowledge that far exceeded our own, sort of an Atlantean perhaps vision. And I think, you know, when we get into pictures like this, we need to be very careful. We have to think very carefully about these people and who they really were. And moving aside from images, we've got their tools. These people certainly produced very beautiful tools, wonderfully made, aesthetically pleasing, balanced and functional objects. And a lot of thought has gone into imagining the kind of culture that these people had. And I've just picked out a few points from a paradigm created by, he's a biologist, Paul Shepard, and it's just worth our while running through a few of these. These people lived in an extended family and a very dense, close social structure. They had early access via speech to a rich memorial tradition. They would have been exposed to storytelling from a very early time. Play as the internal predication or prediction of the living world. They would have been brought up in a context of play. They would have seen animals playing, dogs and other domesticates, wild animals playing, teaching their children. All age access to birth scenes, copulation scenes, death and butchering scenes. Participatory music, handmade objects, no land ownership, extensive foot travel, organic medicine, geronticide, probably voluntary. That's the death of old people. And infanticide. It's quite likely that women practiced infanticide. They had a choice of whether to keep a child or not. Little storage and accumulation, and of course minimal housekeeping. There's some, if you think about it, there's some advantages to this culture. Hospitality to outsiders would have been paramount. That principle existed way through all stages of the prehistoric, right up into the Celtic culture, where it's well documented. Typical size of a fire circle, 10 adults. Hard to say how many children. You're probably marrying inside of a group of 500, perhaps to 3,000 people. Power was decentralized and leadership would have been emergent, according to need. Now, their experience was very much one of spirit in everything. The world was alive. Everything had a living spirit. The animals, the plants, the creatures, the sun, the moon, the stones. Central to their life was the narrative. Speech again. A mythic tradition. A memorial, a rich oral memorial tradition. A rich species taxonomy. Routine recall of this mythology through storytelling to children. Very rich oral narrative. And of course there was access to the places named in this oral narrative, in their mythology, their cosmology, their stories of creation, their stories of how things came into being. There would have been lots of talking about dreams. Dreams, the place where this world blurs into the other world. Lots of attention to kinship and ancestors. Probably highly mythologized ancestors. Close attunement to daily cycles and yearly, annual cycles. Immediate access to wilderness and with it solitude. A non-linear conception of time and space. There is no history. We with our linear time, we have a sense of history. You know, everything is history for us. And of course, history until very recently was the history of great men. The history of nations, the history of states, how things came into being according to what emperor did this, you know, in 500 BC, you know, in Egypt or China or Assyria, or which Aztec ruler, you know, entered the record books as achieving this with the light of a certain destiny that was going to be fulfilled. You know, history always seems to be linked with this projection from the past into the future. These people didn't inhabit that kind of sense of time or place. Of course, these people had very short lives too. If you were a woman, a very good life would have been 2 kids and dead by 35. That would have been a really good life. Of course, most people, 50% of all births, would have been dead by the age of 15, with most of those dying in the first year anyway. Though these people would have had the vitality of youth accompanying that life, and some people, as shown in the archaeological record, will have lived good, healthy, active and fit lives up into their 50s and 60s. And at the center of their lifestyle and their economy is the concept of the gift. The idea that everything that came out of the primal abundance of the great surrounding world came to them as a gift. And this gift was to be shared. We're back to the hospitality principle. Shared with families, shared with neighbours, shared with outsiders. The gift to the stranger. When the first Europeans arrived in North America, they were overwhelmed by the gifts of the native peoples. That was the principle. And formal celebration of life stage passage. Birth, coming of age, death. These are the kinds of things that would have gone on in these Mesolithic, trans-Neolithic societies. Terribly boring, I know, but it's worth thinking about. Now, okay, finally we can get to the fun stuff. So, this idea of a world inhabited by living spirits. I was up on Dartmoor last week, took a photo of this beautiful stone. It's up on Thornworthy Tor. I called it Grandmother Thorn Giant Stone. I love her eye. It's got an eye. Looking at the world. And of course, for these people coming out of a hunter-gatherer context, the encounter with the world was an experience of an encounter with living beings. You never knew what was there. You never knew what your experience was going to be. Was it a bear? Was it a mountain lion? Was it a friendly neighbour? A hostile neighbour? Was it a storm? Was it a lightning strike? A forest fire? A stone giant? Who were you going to encounter? So, finally, we come to Avebury. And that's my partner, Pippa, who unfortunately couldn't come today, but I do all this work with her. And she's leaning on one of the great stones of Avebury. And I've come to see these stones as an assembly of living beings. I don't think there's any other way to describe them. And I think this is how the ancient monument builders of Avebury would have seen them. These were living beings. Beings that their ancestors had encountered in the wild for thousands of years. And it was time to bring them together. It was time to assemble them in one place so they could sing to each other. So that they could tell their stories to each other. So these ancient venerated beings could be brought together with all the energies that they contained and come into a place of central communion. This is the cove at the centre of the northern circle of Avebury. There were originally 3 stones. There was a 3rd stone over here. And it's opening to the extreme northern moonrise. And I like to think that we have some lunar or possibly solar symbolism on this circle here. Stones in the southern circle. and stones in the southwest. These beautiful living beings brought together. And one of the mysteries of Avebury is that there is so little actually found inside of the circle apart from the stones. Archaeologists dig a pit expecting to find charcoal, shards, flints, bones, pottery, and they're not there. What were these people doing? What compelled them to assemble these beings and bring them together? The largest stone circle in the world. 9,900 stones in this great outer circle. A ditch and bank, a quarter of a mile in diameter. Dug in places 40 feet down into the white chalk. So when it was built and the white chalk was thrown up to create the bank, there would have been a circle of white upon the ground. So let's walk up one of the avenues. Let's go back 4,500 years and imagine ourselves walking up the avenue and get a view of Avebury as it looked like at that time. Now, having said that, I don't think a view can ever really do justice. It's too flat. But nonetheless, I've made this recreation from the northern bank, looking south. And you can see the great outer circle. The ditch in front of you. And it's a bit of a jumble, but you can just about make out the northern inner circle. And here's the cove at the centre of it. And then beyond that is the southern inner circle. And the tallest stone on the site, the obelisk, perhaps 18, 19, 20 feet high at the centre of that. And here's the avenue going down to West Kennet, coming in through the southern entrance. And Silbury Hill here in the background. And Waden or Woden's Hill, due south. As I say, these images are really too flat. You have to imagine yourself inside the circle to really get an impression of them. But here's the northern entrance with the Swindon stone here. These are colossal stones. So, when they built this circle, the builders were interested in assembling everything that was sacred and that was meaningful in their world. They brought stones in. They would have brought many other things in. Plants, animals. Perhaps not to stay, because there's no record of them. But the goal seems to have been to have incorporated, to wish to incorporate everything. Perhaps a microcosm of the macrocosm. And so it would have been very important to them to incorporate the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon and stars. Now, many of the features of the site, the great outer circle, the inner circles, weren't put up till quite late in the 3rd millennium. But other stones, such as the cove, the obelisk, the D feature, the ring stone, stones at the southern and the northern entrances, seem to have been put up on the site at a very early time, possibly as early as 3000 BC or even earlier. And what is interesting is that you can draw a line through these early stones, and in fact one of these lines goes through as many as 3/4 of the original stones on the site. So this must be a significant alignment. What were they aligning to? What were they looking at? Is this a way for us to get into the minds of these people and try and work out which celestial bodies they were observing in the sky? I'm not going to attempt to answer that question here because it is so massive and so complex. But I'm going to give you a few pointers. We've mentioned the northern inner circle and the southern inner circle. They think 27, maybe 28 stones in the north, 29 in the south. These are lunar numbers. So we seem to have lunar symbolism at the center of it all. The moon takes a little over 27 days to work through all of its phases. It takes a little over 29 to come back to the same position in the sky. That is, to be visible against the same backdrop of stars. The moon also has an 18.5-year cycle where its line of nodes, the points where it crosses the ecliptic of the sun, travels around the ecliptic on an 19-year cycle. The interesting thing about the nodes is that you can see this is the point where the orbit of the moon crosses the orbit of the sun, and these are the moments when you're going to get an eclipse. So by tracking the lunar cycle, 27, 29 stones, you're beginning to get what you need to track these kinds of complex cycles. And I'm sure many of you here are familiar with the work of Robin Heath, who's shown how Stonehenge and the 56 Avebury holes can be used to make a very accurate eclipse predictor. These people knew the cycles of the sun and the moon inside out. They could track them so well that they could predict when most eclipses were going to happen. Now, why were eclipses important? It's a big subject, but it seems auspicious, inauspicious moments. It was the role of the astronomers of the Chinese courts to be able to predict eclipses with fine accuracy. If they didn't, the emperor had them executed. These were very difficult times. So the emperor, they needed to know when the eclipses were happening. Of course, eclipses tell you when there's an alignment of sun, earth and moon too. Perhaps more of that in a moment. There's actually a sense in which The people who built Avebury knew the lunar and the solar cycles so well that we need to see these circles not as observatories. They didn't need these stones to tell them where the sun and the moon were. They already knew that. But these were ways of revering, of venerating these celestial bodies. That these places are not observatories. They're places to engage with the heavens, to engage with the sun and moon and stars, and venerate them appropriately. All the time, we've got to put the human back into the picture. All the time, we have to imagine ourselves inside the skin of these people. Imagine how they were looking out at the world. And it's a question of identity. You know, how do we think of ourselves? We live in an age where it suits us very well to think of us all as proud, individuated, sovereign beings with our human rights as individuals, free to jump on a plane, explore the world. I mean, isn't that a lovely concept? It just fuels our present economy magnificently. We've all got to have a car. You know, we've all got the rights to have a child. These people didn't think like that. Their identity was perhaps more of a we-identity. It wasn't there's me and then there's the world. There's me in the world, as the world. The self was defined by its encounters with the outside world. The self was defined by context. The self is defined by family, by clan, by lineage, by tribe, by animal, by bird, by place. The spirit of place. There is no self apart from the spirit of place in this world. Can you imagine that? Walking into a place and your skin is so thin that there is no distinction between you and the place you are in. That's how we need to think of how these people encountered the world. So, come into Avebury for a moment in that manner and imagine yourself standing in this diagram at the center. And what we've got, actually let's move on, just there's a bit of detail. So in this diagram you have to imagine yourself standing at the center. You're here. And around you you've got all the stones and the bank, and then you've got the horizon. Here's Windmill Hill up in the northeast. Come round to the Marlborough Downs with Berwick Bassett Down and Hackpen Hill at the northern end of it. Come down here to Overton Hill, Warden Hill in the south, a little rise called Folly Hill over here. That's the world. That's your experience of the world. And we've talked about the cycles of the sun and the moon. You would know summer solstice sun is rising over here in the northeast, setting over here in the northwest. At the winter solstice, the sun is at its lowest in the sky, only going very low over the horizon before setting over here. The moon is tracking the sun. The moon is following the ecliptic of the sun, but it has its own cycles. So it's extremes. At midwinter, when the sun is setting here, the full moon could be rising over here. And you understand these cycles implicitly. You know where they are. You don't need anybody to tell you where the sun is. You don't need anybody to tell you where the moon is. You know that tonight the moon will be rising over there, and the next night it will be rising slightly further back in the next group of stars, the stars that form the celestial sphere. You know all that. It's in your blood, it's in your genes. So everything is rising in the east, moving across the sky and setting in the west. So you're beginning to form a cosmos. The east, the place of emergence, the place where things rise. The west, the place where things set. The progress of the soul through life, moving east to west, being born in the east, setting in the west. West Kennet Long Barrow that we looked at earlier is aligned east-west. It opens to the east. And on top of all that, you have the stars. And looking north, you see that the stars of the sky revolve around a pole. And what can happen is that the stars move round this way. They're moving counterclockwise around a pole. Which means that, say in winter, as it gets dark, stars can appear here in this area of the sky over Windmill Hill, and then they'll set below the horizon. They'll go under the horizon, and then before dawn they'll rise again in the northeast. On the other hand, down in the south, you'll get stars that will appear on the southeast horizon and then only skim over the southern horizon before setting again in the southwest. So you can be aware of two poles in the sky, one visible, around which the stars move in counterclockwise direction, some of which stars briefly set, then rise, whereas in the south there's an invisible pole, hidden, and the stars are only visible for a short length of time. So there can be a distinction made between the northern and the southern hemispheres. A polar axis presents itself. An axis, a pole, anchored to the North Pole, that's visible, that's eternal, and a place that's invisible in the south, that's hidden, maybe a place of the ancestors. And what we're beginning to build up here is it's no longer the world of our hunter-gatherer. We're no longer moving through an unbounded, primal cosmos where you do not know what you're going to encounter, where your skin has to be so thin to be able to sense and deal with everything that you are encountering in the great surround. And there is no permanent settlement. There is no center. What we have here is the beginning of a world that not only has a center, bounded by stones, bounded by ditch and bank, bounded by the horizon for the first time, but also by the stars and the passages of the sun and moon. And from that, we have directions, and we have an axis. There is a world above, and there is a world below. Now we know from studying ancient and shamanic cultures that you can add many other worlds to this picture. Typically, there is not only a single world above and a single world below, but there could be 3 or 4 worlds above, and 3 or 4 further worlds below. Typically, there are 7, 8, or 9 worlds that form the different grounds of being. In some cases, there are up to 27 different worlds, all inhabited by different beings. This is the kind of cosmos in which we need to locate our builders of Avebury. And you see the difference. You see the kind of world that they're beginning to inhabit. This is the Neolithic revolution. We have moved from being an unbounded hunter-gatherer into a centralized, stratified, cosmic human being. We have entered, if you like, the modern world, and its implications are still with us. Now, finally, just as a way of asking how we can realign ourselves to the greater cosmos, asking how we ourselves understand our relationship to the surrounding cosmos, I'm just going to pick out one of the themes that I describe in my book, the forthcoming book on Avebury. And it looks at the intersection of the ecliptic and the Milky Way. At the time Avebury was built, an extraordinary phenomenon was taking place. And this was, during the winter, as the Milky Way rotated downwards towards the west, right at the moment when it touched the horizon in the west, it rose in the east. And so for a few hundred years, around the time of the construction of Avebury, the Milky Way formed a complete ring around the horizon. Now it only does this for a period of time in the cycle of precession, the 26,000 year cycle of precession. And it's quite possible that the ring of white created by the outer bank of the henge was thrown up to be a mirror of the Milky Way in the heavens. As above, so below. And my research has convinced me that as they observed this incredible sight, they were very interested in the two places where the ecliptic, that is, the two places where the sun, the moon, and the planets cross the Milky Way, here in Sagittarius and Gemini, and these two places were central to their narrative, to their key narrative, possibly even their creation story of how the world came into being. Now at the top here, we have got William Stukeley's idea of Avebury recreated. Here's Avebury, here's the Western Avenue, going down to the sanctuary on Overton Hill. Here's the Beckhampton Avenue, running down here past the Longstones Cove, Beckhampton Long Barrow. It gets a bit vague down in this area, with Silbury Hill in the middle. And he saw this as a great serpent. However, I would like to suggest that these avenues might be better envisaged as horns, the horns of a bull, running down here to the Longstones Cove, possibly to the Long Barrow, and running down here to the sanctuary. And you can see once here that Silbury Hill lies between them. Now what I'm driving at, here's Silbury Hill, from the summit of Folly Hill, looking towards the sanctuary. Now what I'm driving at here is a typical evening sky, western horizon. Everything is setting down towards the west. Here's the ecliptic. So the sun has set down here earlier in the night. Any planets are on this path. The moon. Here's the Milky Way, with an imaginary line drawn through the center of it called the galactic equator. Here are the horns of Taurus. And you can see how the horns of Taurus point to this crossing point of the ecliptic and the galaxy. You can also see how Orion, universally seen as the great hunter, is in some way indicating this point. You get the idea? So, Silbury Hill. Here we have the horns, envisaging Avebury as the horns of Taurus, with the crossing point of the galaxy and the ecliptic here. And lo and behold, this is where Silbury Hill is. Silbury Hill. Now, my evidence for the monument builders' interest in this alignment comes from the sanctuary. That is the tip of one of the horns of Taurus at the end of the West Kennet Avenue. And here's a reconstruction. We're looking west through the entrance to the circle towards Silbury Hill, and Folly Hill is just behind the end of Warden Hill here. This is what we're looking at, this point here. And over the time the sanctuary was in use, this crossing point moved across the horizon over a period of time that would have taken us from mid-April to about the 1st of May. And I think they were tracking the processional movement of this point. I think they were looking at the star Alnath in the tip of Taurus that was setting on this central alignment about 2300 BC. I also think they were looking at the other horizon, and they were tracking the rising and setting points of these two intersections. Now, I notice Hugh later is going to be talking about the Ark of the Covenant. I understand he's discovered it. He's going to be producing it later. This is my Ark of the Covenant. This diagram has taken me 20 years to produce, but I finally got there. And in essence, what we're looking at, this is the period from around 45. Each one of these lines represents the horizon. And we're looking at the horizon over time. So here's the horizon, 11,000. In fact, we're looking at the eastern horizon. Eastern horizon, 11,000 BC, 4,500 BC, the present day, and on into the future. So we're looking east, and in 4,500 BC, what was happening is that those two crossing points of the ecliptic and the galaxy were rising at the equinoxes, which you will all instantly know meant they were rising due east. And in fact, they were both rising in the same place. It's only at different times of year. The Sagittarius crossing point would have been rising at the autumn equinox, and the Gemini crossing point would be rising at the spring equinox. But nonetheless, they were both rising due east, by definition, at the equinoxes, at the same point in the horizon. Okay. Now, over the time of Avebury, they were watching these crossing points diverge. They were watching them move slowly further away from the due east, due west points, further north and further south. Until you get to the point where we are today, the year 2000, and you'll find that these two crossing points have reached their extremes, which by definition must be at the solstices. So today, for example, we are seeing the winter solstice sun rising on the crossing point of the galaxy, the galactic equator and the ecliptic, at its most extreme southern point that it will ever reach. Conversely, we are seeing the summer solstice sun rise in Gemini at the most northern point the sun will ever reach in the 26,000 year cycle of precession. Now, you don't have to understand all the details of this, but you can see from this graph that we have reached a major extreme in the 26,000 year cycle of precession. We are literally at a turning point. Now, I talked earlier about how at an eclipse there must be an alignment of moon, earth and sun, or earth, moon and sun. The three must be in alignment for there to be an eclipse. Yes? They must be in alignment. Now, this graph tells us that at a time of an alignment of Earth, Moon and Sun, or Moon, Earth and Sun, at the solstices, we are aligned to the two crossing points of the ecliptic and the galaxy. Now it so happens that the Gemini point looks away from the center of the galaxy, and the Sagittarius point is over the center of the galaxy. So to cut a long story short, if there is a solar eclipse at this time, there is an exact alignment of Earth, Moon, Sun, and galactic center. And you will know when that's happening because there will be an eclipse, by definition. This is the kind of astronomy that these people were practicing. They weren't figuring this all out with computers and graphs like we're doing here. They were simply doing it through hands-on astronomy on the ground, by looking at where the sun and moon were, by keeping tabs of it, using their stone circles as convenient devices to count. But through that simple methodology, they were able to arrive at that kind of calculation. The Maya were able to do it, and they worked it out using their long counts and their other counts to produce the Zolkin calendars. They knew this alignment was coming up, this turning point in the galactic cycles, and I think I have found the evidence that they were doing the same thing at Avebury. They were looking at these counts, not in the way we look at them, externally, but experientially. They knew what it felt like to experience this kind of alignment. And to find out more and get the evidence, I think I'm on time. Sorry, there was no time. Into what our ancestors were doing here in this land all those many, many years ago. Now, when I jumped into the topic, I realized that, well, at times I felt completely underwater. It's so massive. There's so much connected with Avebury and all the sites around it that I couldn't possibly cover them all. And in this talk too, that it's not going to be possible to go very deeply into the whole topic, but we'll just have a look and just go in where we can and explore and see what opens up. And it's been fun doing these recreations. I don't think they can really do justice to what was there thousands of years ago, but they're fun, aren't they? They're good to look at, and they give us an idea of what Avebury was all about. So, we're going to begin at Windmill Hill, and here is a plan of the enclosure that the first people who settled in the Avebury area built at the beginning of the 4th millennium BC. So they built these concentric rings on the hilltop. It's about a mile outside of Avebury, after about 3800 BCE. These were Mesolithic people. And it seems that Mesolithic culture in Britain had developed. Thanks, Peter. Thank you. Right, thank you very much. And it's good to be back here again. You all indulged me last year by listening to my talk on the sacred geometry of Washington, D.C. And I noticed that Dan Brown has picked up on that theme with his latest book. So it is obviously a topical subject. But in a way, that book was clearing a backlog. Because when I began looking at Britain, British history, the British megalithic sites, over 30 years ago, of course it was Avebury that fascinated me. And I was just impelled to think about the place and visit the place and try to understand something about it, but I didn't have anything to say. And at that point, realizing that I had very little to say about Avebury, I went to the States. And I spent time over there, and it was a very important interlude. It taught me many things, not least an understanding of the role of the wilderness, the animals, the big animals in particular, the animals that no longer inhabit these islands. So when I came back, I felt I was bringing a lot of knowledge with me, but it's taken a long time to ground myself back in this land. And in the end, it was Avebury that called me, presented itself to my attention, and I just feel very humbled indeed that this information has come, that at last we're getting some deeper illumination in other areas at first, especially in the West. And people came and settled in the Avebury area quite late, relatively speaking. And this could be because of the nature of the water supply in this part of the world. It's chalk. These are chalk hills. It's very porous. The rain just dissolves into the surface of the land. And as a result, the springs and the streams dry up in the summer months. So it's possible that people only began settling on Windmill Hill in the late autumn, when the springs and the streams began to flow again. So we have a picture. People coming, arriving in the area, hunting, gathering, and bringing with them their herds of animals. This is the innovation. This is the Neolithic revolution, the agricultural revolution. They're pasturing animals, and they're beginning to grow some grain crops. Probably for these people, their cattle, their pigs were more important. As the year drew to a close, they began to sacrifice, treat some of these animals in a very reverential way, slaughtered them and placed them in these ditches and in the pits of the enclosures. Sometimes it's bones, disjointed bones, sometimes whole animals, whole cattle are laid to rest in these pits. A few miles south of Avebury is another one of these causewayed enclosures, a hilltop before being put back in again. This long barrow perhaps was in use for 1,000 years or even more before it was closed. And this is the people of Avebury put this massive blocking stone up across the entrance to the long barrow, effectively sealing it after 1,000 years or more of use. Now here we have another reconstruction, and we're well over 1,000 years later, and we're at another site in the Avebury area known as the Sanctuary. And it's a combination of timber and stone. I've suggested a possible reconstruction here. I've put lintels, wooden lintels on top of the wooden posts. Gives it a coherence. But they combine stone with this monument too. This is how it might have looked like towards the end of the 3rd millennium. But before we begin talking about what these sites may have been used for, what they were all about, there's a question I want to bring to your attention. And it is a question of identity. Who were these people? Who were these Mesolithic, transitional, Neolithic, early farmers and settlers? And I like this figure because it doesn't seem to have a skin. There's a suggestion with a ring, a bank and ditch around the summit. This one's known as Knapp Hill. Several of these enclosures were built in the area, but then at some point in the middle of the 4th millennium BC, the first real innovations begin. These people begin to build in stone. And they built a long barrow, West Kennet Long Barrow. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. We've got a little view inside. I've no idea what the lights are. They begin to build in stone. So there's a transitional period here. There's some earlier monuments in the area, Fossils Lodge. They're using timber to prop up the banks of the Long Barrow. But now they're beginning to use stone. And of course, the date of this, 3600 BC. They're working in mud brick in Egypt. Barry brought our attention to the other early megalithic builders in Europe. But this is an extraordinary early date. And these people entered into a very complex relationship with this Long Barrow and others in the area. It seems to have been used for the interment of the dead, but not all of their dead. And in many cases, not always the entire body. It's quite likely parts of the body, parts of the skeleton were taken out, used, displayed in other contexts,